One of the things that I think is so important about this book is that it contextualizes Trump's decision as a president within the broader cross currents of his life. You know, the person he became as a figure in New York City society, and also who he was as a child. When we talk about this impunity, that's not something that was kind of like gifted to him as president. It's something he always had. And this is another story that I think is really important, kind of the Citizen Kane Rosebud moment. Well, I'm not going to call it a Rosebud moment. I won't put that level of import on it. But it is so indicative of who he becomes later. In Trump's senior year of high school, the school administration gave Trump a promotion to captain of a company. This is in his military school. Classmates questioned whether he deserved the prestigious post, and they suspected it was granted to him because of his father's influence at the school. As the captain, Trump was charged with leading other boys in the unit, but he did so at a remove. A former classmate, Sandy McIntosh, wrote, when one student in A Company was brutally hazed by another, the story at the school was that Donald Trump stayed in his room, listening to his record player. The hazed student complained to his parents, and Trump was removed from his position. Trump refused to concede defeat, insisting that he had really been given a promotion to another title. I mean, the shadows, the echoes of what later transpires after the election in 2020 are impossible to miss. And yet, can you talk a little bit more about the person he was even in his teen years when it came to questions of loss and defeat?
I think you raised a question I just want to go back to, or a point that I want to go back to, which is about his sense of entitlement. And I think that people lose track of this because he talks like somebody who a lot of voters who support him will say, he sounds like me, he expresses thoughts like me. The reality is that he was the son of a well-off man, and he grew up as a child of privilege, and that in a certain way, there are people who grow up with privilege who don't expect that systems don't apply to them. But that wasn't him, and he expected that things were always going to be set up for him, and he refused to accept the world in a way that was not on his terms. Now, I think he did more earlier when he was a younger kid, but by the time he gets to the end of high school, he has pretty much figured out who he is. And he doesn't have to accept the world as it is in his twisted mind. I mean, there's also a part of this book where you talk about how Trump decides he's going to refuse to leave the White House in the days after the 2020 election loss. And that is a remarkable anecdote that you talk about. And it is also something that people have criticized you for in terms of having that in the book right now, as opposed to when this whole, attempt to steal the election transpired. Talk to me a little bit about how you make and made decisions as far as what to leave in the book, what to report out, and the sort of process by which you did that. Sure. So I turned in earnest to this project after the second impeachment trial, which ended, I think, in February of 2021. And a book is different. A book takes time. I wanted to paint a broader contextual portrait of a person's life, and not just a person's life, but of our country, of how he came to be, how a celebrity-obsessed culture came to see him as an avatar for what it for at least half the country, what it wanted, and certainly a party what it wanted. How he had infused himself into the pop culture fabric for such a long period of time, and that takes time. It's a process of going back and talking to sources over and over again and learning more information. I provided a significant amount of reporting to the Times throughout the process, and that wasn't different. But it's just an entirely different experience doing a book. And one thing I think about a lot was I spoke to, several years ago, I talked to someone who I knew had cooperated for a bunch of these books that had been coming out during the presidency. And there was a story in one of them that the person had refused to tell me. And I had caught wind of it, or there was some reason why I was upset. But I asked a question of, why do people do this? Why do you talk for books and you won't for a daily report? And their answer was, there's no immediacy to it. It's not coming out tomorrow. I'm talking, and it's just, it's a problem for future me, was essentially what this person was suggesting. And I think that informs a lot about why people are willing to talk when they do.
Interesting. I mean, there's a decision on the part of the source to say this is going to happen in the future, and the blowback I catch, if I catch any, will be in some future undetermined time and place.